So my name is Adom Heron. I'm an anthropologist by training, and I teach in the anthropology department at Goldsmiths University. And I specialize in the Caribbean. My interests extend from an interest in kinship, as well as the history of storms and how people respond to hurricanes in the Caribbean. But more generally, I'm interested in the Atlantic world and the various different connections between Caribbean people and the places that they settle and reside.
This is quite a significant site that we're in. So not just here, this was the house of a guy called Henry Bright. And he was from a family who had significant investments in Jamaica, in sugar plantations. But also he became a mayor of the city and also was an MP for part of his life as well in the 1700s. And the reason that this house is quite significant in terms of us thinking about the kind of the geography of moving through Bristol, and particularly as someone who's a kind of descendant myself, but also many people within the city are descendants of folks who came over from the 1950s onwards from the Caribbean, who have ancestors who were enslaved people, is that etched in our landscape, the landscape of our city, are all of these kind of day-to-day reminders of that past, a past which most of us move through the city not entirely aware of. So I wasn't aware until very, very recently that this house belonged to a sugar planter who had significant investments in Jamaica, as I mentioned, who petitioned government in the first instance, so he was an MP, and petitioned in the House of Parliament to actually stop the slave trade from ending. Once the slave trade had ended, then he petitioned for amelioration rather than emancipation. So amelioration being the kind of the tightening up of kind of basically the claim to kind of appease abolitionists was to suggest, okay, well, we're not going to get rid of slavery. We can make slavery gentler and kinder and more friendly, if there's such a thing. And that was the claims they were made because they didn't want to lose their free labor, essentially. If we kind of do a kind of a 360 and look around the square, you'll see that it's actually quite a kind of an opulent, quite kind of beautiful space, and that a lot of these buildings around here belong to various different members of the merchant class. But also it was the site of the 1831 rebellions. I can see some of my neighbours. Hello, our neighbours. How you doing? Sorry, I went straight in there.
Have you been there?
No, I've never been in before. No. Have you?
No, but I think a lot of these are still just a facade. I think like back, or maybe it's one of them, like the whole back of it was taken off.
Oh, mad.
Maybe it's this one.
So they've just kept the old fascia of it. You guys just doing a little tour around?
Little ice cream tour.
Oh, nice. What did you go for?
Mango sorbet and raspberries.
Oh, lovely. Good choice. And did you share?
No.
Oh, okay. Yours is already gone. Long gone. Yeah, it's pretty mad. The more you kind of do research on this stuff, the more you realise, like,
It's
how deep that history is, you know?
It is inextricably linked with everything. It's difficult to come away with, like going to places like Tinsel and stuff, like it's difficult to keep, like I'm not a patriot by any stretch of imagination, but it's, you know, a lot of these buildings you do kind of have a relationship with and love, and it's difficult to kind of work out what that means.
To reconcile that with once you get that new information about the place. Yeah, it's true. And I think that's kind of, that honest conversation is kind of what's needed to develop a sense of everyone feeling at home in the city.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that we need to tear down buildings, but we just need a kind of an honest and open conversation to be like, well, where is that history present in the city, and what does it represent? What does it mean? And then we can kind of come to terms with that. Oh, see you later, guys. Nice catching up. Take care. The day that the protest had happened, and everyone, like in so many different cities around the country, I think everyone had been inside. They'd seen these images, these horrible graphic images of this violent murder, and it had sparked all kinds of different feelings in people, feelings of anger, feelings of frustration. It brought up all of this pain and trauma, connecting people's own experiences, perhaps folks who are based here in the city, elsewhere in the UK, who've experienced various different kinds of racism. And then I guess everybody just came out, and it was actually, it felt almost like carnival. And that's not to trivialize it, because carnival's got kind of quite revolutionary kind of rebel origins in the Caribbean. It felt like the Caribbean carnival that we have here, which involves, it's kind of a multiracial celebration founded on the tradition of Caribbean carnival, but that brings the city together. And there was this incredible sense of like sociality and just people feeling like they wanted to be together in this moment. And so I went to the protest and then didn't actually witness the statue coming down. I went to the end of the protest because I got there quite late, and then got reports from people who I was bumping into, friends that I went to school with, who were showing me videos on their phone of the statue coming down. And so there was this sense of kind of jubilance amongst the kind of the crowd as everyone was moving along. And I came back with my daughter, who's small. We cycled around, me and my wife and my daughter, on the bike, and kind of just took all of it in. And that thing of everyone coming out after being at home inside for so long, there was this beautiful kind of just coming together of the city, and it felt like a kind of a space of healing in many ways. And then we went around, saw the empty plinth as well, which we'll see later. And then I came home at the end of the day and was up all night following all the different debates on Twitter and everything. And like often happens if you look at your phone too late at night, it's hard to get to sleep. And so at about midnight, something compelled me to just get up out of my bed.
Yeah, it has like a whole
and cycle into the center of town. And so as we're walking, we can kind of retrace kind of part of the route from where I would have been coming from to where I went to follow the kind of the path of them bringing down the statue. I think for a lot of people, the fact that it was the first time they were seeing other people, and there was this sense of sense of pain and sense of anger and sense of frustration, which had to come out and had to be released. But I think as well as that, and this is something which Akil Mbembe and Paul Gilroy have spoken and written about a little bit, is that there's something about the fact that the reason everybody was locked down was because of this respiratory disease. Yeah. And the way that the guy was murdered was through asphyxiation. And there was something very bodily that everybody is able to relate to as they were facing their own mortality in relation to this devastating pandemic, in relation to its effects on the respiratory disease and the ways in which life was being taken away and breath was being taken away from this person at the hands of the state. And so I think it brought home the kind of the reality of anti-Black violence in the most vivid possible way. The awakening in the city here, I think, was powerful because I think it could come out and people have the architecture to respond to. They have these kind of these monuments around the city to respond to, and the history is never far from you. As you walk the cobbled streets, you can see back into that Atlantic history that involves the kidnapping and profiting from enslaved Black bodies, both in terms of their free coerced labor on plantations. Many of the owners of those plantations would have resided in houses around here. We've got a building just across there, the Customs House, which is just behind some trees over there. The original Customs House was burnt down in the Bristol riots, part of that revolutionary history that we have in the city. But the original Customs House would have processed all of the kind of the taxation of ships that were bringing in enslaved produce from the Caribbean and products from North America, cotton, tobacco, coffee, cocoa, sugar, of course, being central to that. The city of Bristol had 40 sugar refineries. One of them was owned, to my mind, by Edward Colston as well. So the merchant class of the city grew incredibly wealthy from that history, and Bristolians are aware of that. There's not enough of a deep conversation. It's not in the syllabus of schools for students to really be aware of the specifics of that history and the depth of it, but there's a sense you grow up early on, especially as a Black person in Bristol, you grow up early on knowing that this was a site of incredible wealth from the slave trade and then from exploitation on various different plantations and so on, that you're aware of that history. And then also you have the experience of day-to-day racism that you're able to connect with that history. So it feels deep-rooted, it feels like an ongoing, continuous kind of continuous experience of oppression, essentially.
Seeing like Colston's name there, and I was just thinking about how like these inscriptions in the, sorry to interrupt you.
No.
Seeing like these inscriptions also in these kinds of, it's not just these old statues, but also like signage like this in Colston Hall that kind of is how these layers are kind of inscribed in the city in like a very everyday way, as well as these kind of monuments that are like to history in a sense. I think is really...
It brings it back into the present, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I want to take us over here to the Merchant Venturers Arms House over here. But as we're walking, it's also interesting to think that, again, the intimate presence of these figures. My sister went to Colston Girls' School, so she was there as a descendant of Caribbean and of once enslaved people.
Every November, I think it was 14th, we used to had Commemoration Day, which was to commemorate Edward Colston. I think that might have been the day that he either founded the school or died. Don't really know because I never used to pay any interest. And we used to have to, one day a year, well, twice a year, we'd wear our special uniforms, so the hat we had and different things that we had to wear. So twice a year. One of them was Prize Day, the other day was obviously Commemoration Day. And we used to have to wear a bronze chrysanthemum because that was his favourite flower. So you were forced to buy the flower, whether you wanted to wear it or not, you had to wear it. And then you were told that at the end of the service that you do at the cathedral, you were supposed to all line up very respectfully and silently and walk to the centre, to the statue, and throw your chrysanthemum at him in gratitude and appreciation.
So this is the Merchant Venturers Arms House. The Merchant Venturers was a guild of kind of venture capitalists who basically monopolise or controlled, I should say, the trade of shipping through the port of Bristol. And they had kind of deep investment and involvement in Caribbean sugar trade, but also in the slave trade as well. And it was built for crew members, for sailors who would have been aboard those ships, who were now kind of had various different kinds of diseases, or were much older, to care for them kind of in their later lives when they'd come back. So it's interesting to think of the kind of the care and the paternal care, and there's a kind of a clear power relation there, and there's kind of a celebration of the kindness of these merchants. But the kind of that kind of generosity is getting extended to those who piloted and kind of worked on their ships, but not to the enslaved people who weren't recognised as human, who were carried and treated as cargo and as possessions. So, but again, like, to step away from the kind of the academic and all the history and all the kind of memorialising, I'd cycle past this place regularly and never had any idea that this is what this place was. It was almost just kind of an old building in the city, and you wouldn't know the kind of the detail and the history that inheres in the place until you get a little bit closer and kind of read beyond some of the layers, or just take a moment just to be still in the place and take some of it in, you know. As a child, as a teenager moving through the city, it was a completely unexciting, uninteresting, old piece of, like, an old civic monument, and I probably didn't see it as anything more than that. But one thing which you would remember and which people would find humorous would be that every now and again there'd be a new thing that would be done to the statue, and that was part of, like, the city's kind of response to those feelings and to what Colston was seen to represent. So at any given time he'd have a traffic cone on his head. At any given time he'd have red paint thrown on him as well. And Hugh Locke as well, who's a kind of West Indian British artist, also did some really interesting kind of installation where he basically took a kind of a photograph, made a model, and then kind of recast kind of edited the statue, basically. So it looks like the statue actually has all of these golden trinkets, these cheap golden trinkets, and coins and kind of jewellery hanging round the neck of Colston. Really heavy, kind of to represent the kind of the guinea coin of the Royal Africa Company, which was their kind of trading currency that they used to trade in kidnapped and trafficked bodies of black people, but also the kind of the various different symbols of wealth just kind of hanging from his neck.
And I think contrasting the kind of, this like weight of wealth and with the sort of the philanthropic kind of image of like, oh, you kind of funded these schools or these like places where, I don't know, often maybe the symbols of like philanthropists like humble wealth almost, being like, oh, I'm kind of benevolently sharing this, whereas having him...
This is but too much for one man, let me pass it on to future generations.
Yeah, whereas actually like having him draped in this like weight of wealth is kind of a much more opulent, like, no, this was a kind of a harmful extraction.
An ostentatious kind of performance of what's been taken and expropriated.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's so true. I couldn't agree more. It's kind of, and I think it was humorous, but it was also a provocation to kind of reckon with what that figure represents. But someone's Tipexed in rather than erected by the citizens of Bristol, rejected by the citizens of Bristol in 2020.
And even the language of the plaque as a memorial of one of the most virtuous and wise sons of their city. It's really kind of, I don't know, there's something about the language that's used on these plaques that's really kind of chilling, I think. And considering, I also, you were talking earlier about like when these monuments were erected and like during this particular period of nationalism, or kind of, can you talk like a little bit more about that, I guess? Yeah,
the little that I know from research, and there's an incredible body of research, so I wouldn't be claiming that these are my own kind of discoveries or anything, but the Victorians at the time of the age of nationalism erected various different civic monuments to kind of bestow in the public a sense of kind of public consciousness and a sense of public duty and moral responsibility. And the merchant class of the city commissioned the statue and pressed for the statue to be here over 100 years after Colston had died. And essentially the idea was that, over 150 years after he died, and essentially the idea was that, as far as I see it, they were projecting their own image of a benevolent entrepreneur onto this figure of Colston that would reposition how he was remembered in the city. So a lot of the historical records suggest that he wasn't universally loved within the city, that actually his almshouses perhaps were quite kind of joyless places, as one scholar's referred to them, and that his schools perhaps were quite pragmatically created as a kind of a means of him having a kind of a group of students who would come out of his schools who might be loyal to him and might also want to work on his ships as well. In essence, what we've got a figure who maybe wasn't universally celebrated in the time of his being alive in the city, maybe was quite a kind of a calculated and kind of quite a shrewd businessman, and that was devoutly Anglican and that had a particular set of moral standards that if people didn't adhere to them, they wouldn't be allowed in his schools. If people had certain diseases, they wouldn't be allowed in his schools as well. So maybe he wasn't quite the benevolent figure that the Victorians were trying to project at the time when they wanted the city and the nation, perhaps more broadly, to get this sense of kind of civic pride, civic nationalism, and also to see them as being the kind of the people to be celebrating at the helm of that, these benevolent givers who don't just keep all their wealth for themselves but give them back. And I guess Colston was seen as a kind of a symbol of that to this merchant class. The man was kind of a key shareholder and eventually a kind of a senior figure and director of the Royal Africa Company for 12 years, and the Royal Africa Company are the single British institution which is responsible for trafficking the greatest number of enslaved people to the New World, 150,000 at an estimate. And under his kind of tenure within the institution, the estimates is that there were roughly 84,000 enslaved African people kind of under his watch who were transported to the Americas. Now, 84,000 people left on ships. This is what the record tells us. There may have been more, may have been left. 84,000 people left on ships. 64,000 people arrived. So when Marvin Rees, the mayor of the city, and the first elected black mayor in Europe, who is also a descendant of enslaved Caribbean peoples. When he went on the news and Christian Guru Murphy was, have I got his name right? Yeah, Christian, was asking him, what do you think about this statue coming down? He was saying there's a certain historical poetry to the fact that a man who was responsible collectively and personally responsible for X number of enslaved people dying at sea on the voyages across the Atlantic to take them to the New World, nearly 20,000 people. There's a poetry to the fact that his statue would meet its end in a kind of a watery grave in the Bristol docks as well, where many of those ships left off from. So on the night that the statue was brought down, and I mentioned that I came down here at about midnight, and so what happened on the day, probably people have seen the videos, that the statue was brought down, and then various activists gave speeches or stood or even danced on top of the plinth. And I remember coming down and it felt like a kind of a weight had been lifted. There were people milling around. It felt like the end of kind of carnival when there's still a kind of a palpable kind of excited energy in the air. There was a certain kind of optimism, but more than anything, it felt like people were kind of holding wake. Paul Gilroy talked about this kind of the need for Britain to engage in a kind of an post-imperial mourning of the loss of empire as a nation, that Britain has never really kind of grasped the fact that it's fallen from this grandeur which it claimed to that not being the case anymore. And that the part of the lack of that kind of proper mortuary rite, kind of collective process of kind of ritually saying goodbye to empire in a kind of a meaningful way, and kind of, but also facing that past, is that there's this weird kind of melancholia, as he refers to it, that produces all of these strange kind of things like the peculiar All Lives Matter gathering, which happened exactly here. I think it was a week after the statue came down. In Jamaica, they have the notion of the duppy as a spiritual presence that kind of moves around in the landscape, and until you go through the full mortuary rites, don't get put to rest. But they're a malevolent presence, and they can do sinister things, and they're dangerous as well. Bob Marley's song "Duppy Conqueror" talks about if you're a big buckra, which is the name that they gave to the kind of slave owner, then I'm a duppy conqueror. And I feel like Bristol conquered the duppy in a sense of Colston to some degree, that was haunting the city. I think there were a lot of people that were, I don't know, I guess I'd have to ask them. I'd have to ask what is it in the symbol of Colston which they feel so at home with, and that they wouldn't want to let go of, and that they see as being kind of an important symbol of a history that they want to surround them in the city, and they want to be kind of memorialised as they move through the city in these everyday kinds of ways. And how much is at stake for them in terms of this being taken away. I can't understand that level of investment in the name, kind of responses that are very kind of recalcitrant. Like it's kind of really rooted. This is how our city is. This is how landmarks are named, and we want it to stay that way.
Is it also, do you think, about just being blind to things, that like if you admit that like, oh yeah, that should change, then it's like you've been complicit in something for such a long time?
I think that's a really, really good point.
Yeah.
I mean, you show that you've been kind of invested in this particular telling of the city, and particularly, I think the uncomfortable thing is where those historical violences are brought to bear on the present, and then it forces us to make commitments in the present to a more egalitarian way of ordering our society, to anti-racist work, which maybe a lot of white people don't necessarily feel ready to do. I'm not sure what's at stake for them, what that would cost them. It doesn't seem for me like it would cost anything close to an even kind of symbolic gesture in relation to how much it's cost the people whose backs carried that wealth. And a lot of people have suggested that that the leader of the Bristol bus boycotts should stand in his place. My thought is that we should have a statue to him, and that should perhaps be close to where Colston was stood, have the centrality and pride of place within the city, but perhaps there's a possibility of leaving the plinth empty as a kind of to speak to all that was taken in a symbolic way, to speak to the kind of the future that we might hope to see.
There's a historian called, I think his name's Paul Weller, who says that history hates empty pedestals. And I think that's interesting because I think for me it resonates with the work of Trujillo, kind of thinking about like this official, but like this true version of this one particular account that obviously silences others. And in leaving it empty, it's kind of not, it's kind of almost thinking about history, but also thinking about the future, like you're saying, about these possibilities and about these kind of imaginings of what the future could be, or what might be there, or what could be there, or what could have been there had Colston not been there. And I think
it's so interesting. History hating empty pedestals. And Trujillo has some things to say to that as well, that maybe might be at odds with what perhaps you'd expect, insofar as he's saying that there's no way that that present actors can be responsible for these kinds of historical crimes. But what you can do is you can respond to and you can act politically in relation to the privileges that those histories might afford you, and the legacies that you might that we inherit, and you can respond to how those particular histories inhere in the present and position you in particular ways in the present as well. And I think that is when people are claiming that history is being erased, and when people are taking it very personally, well, I wasn't the person who enslaved your ancestors, then I think they're taking all of that history into the present. There are also some pitfalls as well to the kind of self-reflective kind of response that can risk becoming navel gazing, and that can also kind of recenter the awakening of white people to racial violence and racial injustice, right? So it's like 2020, the year when white people discovered that racism exists, you know, and that in the process of that happening, it became like this interesting kind of performative thing. Well, like, I've got to do better, I need to understand better, I need to do all of these things. It's like, maybe it's not necessarily about you. Like, you can be doing that work at home, but you don't necessarily need to be asking black people for reading lists, because those reading lists are there in the public domain and they're quite easy to access as well. And I think that I feel a little bit ambivalent to that. Like, I wouldn't kind of be one of those people who just kind of call this out and dismiss it, because there are certain opportunities for some really useful, productive work to take place in the spaces that are being opened up. So where we're walking now is along the route that Colston would have been dragged, or that his statue would have been dragged, by a huge number of people as they're on their way to Perrow's Bridge. And Perrow's Bridge are these kind of two kind of horns that you can see, kind of funnel things coming up. And that's named after an enslaved man. It's actually one of the very few monuments in recognition and memory of an enslaved person. This same body of water here that would have brought ships across the Atlantic connects directly to the same body of water, which is the Atlantic and which is the Caribbean Sea. There's no point of kind of blockage between them. There was a continuous flow at that time of ships between there, and the movement of water continues between there as well. And Christina Sharpie's written a book called In the Wake, which is all about the afterlives of slavery, and thinking about them in terms of that kind of wake and momentum of the ship. The movement of the water behind the ship, is to think about everything that came after the slave ship, everything that came after the plantation, in terms of how black lives are still affected by that history. And she talks about this thing called residence time, which is the time that the organic material of the enslaved people who would have died at sea and would have been thrown overboard, how long they'd last within the oceans and the seas at a kind of an elemental level. And she says that would continue to be the presence of the kind of the physical fragments of enslaved bodies are still present in the water. And that's the same continuous body of water that Colston would have found himself in. So it's interesting to think that he was mingling perhaps around the parts of the bodies of people who he's responsible for finding their ends in the water, and that's where he met his end here. And so just kind of reflecting on that a little bit and thinking about the kind of, and this was the point where the statue was thrown in, just thinking about that, the significance of that, and kind of reflecting on that a little bit, for me at least, was really, really powerful. And it made me realise that what took place here, there was a reason why it became, when I spoke to colleagues in America, they immediately knew Bristol for this particular moment within the space of a few hours, and that led to the felling of statues of Columbus in places like Boston, and indigenous people as well, bringing down statues of Columbus as well, which was incredibly powerful. And it made me realise that this connected body of water of the Atlantic holds together so many of these histories in a similar kind of connected way, that this part of the world is held to North America and is held to the kinds of historical and continuous violences that take place there as well. So for me, it was really powerful that this connects with there, and that it's part of a broader kind of Atlantic history that's still very much present and with us. Nobel laureate of the Caribbean, or one of the Nobel laureates of the Caribbean, Derek Walcott. He's got a poem called The Sea is History, and he's having a conversation with someone who says that the Caribbean's got no history, and in his poetic response to this person asking him, well, where are your monuments to your great figures, and he says the open grey vault of the sea has swallowed them up. The sea is history. So the sea is the kind of the connective tissue that holds the Caribbean together, and he's forced to say that for the Caribbean because of the kinds of historical erasures of and the massacre of indigenous people, and then also the ways in which enslaved peoples were dispossessed and their cultures were kind of broken and fragmented as they were taken to the Caribbean. And he talks about the Caribbean as being kind of made up of these fragments of epic memory from the various different continents that people came from and that are remade into something new in the Caribbean. It's such a pertinent question in relation to what we're talking about. The idea that violence is to think of violence as a closed episode of injuring someone, or particularly within the way that it's spoken about now, something, as in property, as in buildings, memorials, etc. To think violence in those terms is something discrete that happens at a given moment in a given incident and then ends, misses maybe the way that I would invite people to think about violence. To think about violence as kind of something which is that endures, that leaves scars that wounds that don't maybe perhaps fully close, or wounds that begin to kind of scab over and then new injuries arrive on top of them. Thinking about violence in kind of more continuous and symbolic terms. And we can still locate that within particular forms of action that happen, things which are done to people, but we see that as part of a much larger and longer set of relationships, violent, unequal relationships, that mean that when a black man is killed in America and it's recorded and it happens so slowly and it happens in such a... And I'm mindful of not wanting to revisit that image, because even when I begin to conjure it, I can see the casual way in which the man is knelt, the white man is knelt on the black man's neck. All of that evokes in so many people a very, very deep, long and enduring history that means that violence refracts into all of these other moments of violence and experiences of violence and kind of enduring experiences of them. And they kind of become layered on top of one another. So I think it's important for us to think about violence as well as being related to trauma too, and that there can be layers of trauma on top of one another as well, and that they can be passed intergenerationally too, and that when you can feel those traumas being kind of playing out again and again and again, one of the main things that people I think a lot of black organisers and academics are saying at the moment is that they're saying I'm tired of all of this violence, I'm tired of having to repeatedly respond to it, I'm tired of having to explain this thing which I'm not producing but that I'm trying to fight against. And so even the work of having to do that kind of labour, I guess, also feels violent. So we've got symbolic violence and then we've got physical manifestations that both revisit trauma again and again and again. I think that's part of the exhaustion as well, is that the more you begin to see these relationships within the landscape as you move through them, the more you begin to kind of become aware of the histories that underpin the present social order. That kind of becomes self-perpetuating. You begin to see these things more because you begin to know where to look for them or know how they manifest themselves as well. So you begin to kind of think, okay, well, this is a very opulent building in Bristol. It was built in a certain era. I wonder what the relationship is to this history that I've begun to uncover about the city. In some places, that healthy critical reading is useful because it enables you to kind of decode space a little bit. But then in many instances it can kind of send you mad because you kind of got to pick your battles, you know. Like I think in the year after I graduated from university, I was spending a lot of time cycling through London, and it was the time of the financial crash, and I'd been learning about these histories of racial capital and the history of the relationship between folks who'd made their money from sugar, reinvested those profits within the banking sector, the way that insurance kind of mechanisms were in some ways kind of pioneered to compensate slave traders who'd thrown bodies overboard of people who were likely not to make the full passage and able to get the kind of the money that they were deemed to be worth back. To think about those kinds of histories of the social order we inhabit today, as I was moving through the city at the same time as the financial crisis was hitting the most vulnerable people within society, it almost sent me mad, to be honest. So I think this is something which I tried to, I'm increasingly realise that I need to really be careful with my students as I'm talking about these histories, and I'm talking about their bearing on the present past, if you will. That will be that. It might be difficult for them to hold all of that. It's a lot to hold, and especially when you don't have a clear outlet for it, and especially if it's not within your immediate capacity to be able to change that. So something like this statue being brought down and then thrown into the water becomes a moment where people feel a sense of being able to respond to this architecture which isn't theirs and which feels heavy and that weighs on them as they move through the city, that almost feels like it's kind of leaning on them. They're able to cast that off and feel a kind of a sense of being able to do something about it, being able to kind of overturn something.